Hi, this is Dr. Jabali, and in this video, we're going to talk about topic 2.8, which is all about cell respiration. We're going to go through previous IB exam questions, the most common questions that falls for this section. So let's go from the first one. It says here the command word describe. Now remember, whenever we talk about describe, you can write in words, but I also advise you to draw things because usually drawing can get you points. Now here it says describe the role of oxygen in aerobic cell respiration. Now, you can see from the word aerobic here, this automatically means that there is oxygen. Now, cell respiration is usually happening in the mitochondria. In the mitochondria, what we're doing, we're breaking down eventually glucose in order to bring out of it energy. In this case, the energy will be ATP. Now, in the process of cell respiration, none of this can happen from glucose becoming energy without the presence of oxygen. So with the presence of oxygen in the mitochondria, we can make up to 38 ATP as energy. But if there is no oxygen whatsoever, then we go towards anaerobic. And in this case, then we're going through fermentation. And if the fermentation is happening in humans, it eventually turns into lactic acid. And lactic acid does not give much energy, so this is usually why people get so tired when they're not breathing oxygen. They get weakened up in their body because lactic acid is building up in the blood, causing the pH to drop and becoming acidic, so you feel painful towards it. So we're trying to figure out what is the role of oxygen. Obviously, is that oxygen is a very important element in the mitochondria. It's like basically the final electron acceptor. What does that mean? That means in order to actually break down glucose, the less hydrogen that will bind to the oxygen, it will cause the whole production of ATP. Without that oxygen, that means we cannot go through the entire process. And what I mean by the process, when I'm talking about the process is this. If you want to go through the entire aerobic respiration, first you have to go through glycolysis. And in glycolysis, you have glucose be broken down to pyruvate. Now, if you do have oxygen, in this case, then you're definitely going to go through the link reaction, you're going to go through the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. All of these are actually happening in the mitochondria. And that's just because you do have oxygen. And in the process, you end up forming energy, which is 38 ATP. However, if you don't have any oxygen in there, then that pyruvate will turn into lactic acid. And that means you're barely producing any ATP, usually just 2 ATP. And this 2 ATP is usually coming from glycolysis. So that's why it is very important to have oxygen in order for you to be able to break down that glucose. Now let's see what the mark scheme usually say. So the first thing it says here, it's a terminal final electron acceptor. That is true because when it comes to the mitochondria, which we have here, the mitochondria, and we have the whole process, we have here the electron transport chain. And for that electron transport chain, which is the last process of the aerobic respiration, it can only happen if oxygen is present in order to receive the hydrogen that is coming from the Krebs cycle. See, on the Krebs cycle, there are two things that forms, which is FADH2 and NADH. Now, these two are carrying very important energized hydrogens, and these hydrogens are taken to the ETC. And ETC will cause eventually the production of ATP. But this cannot happen unless oxygen is there. Why? Because the oxygen will receive these hydrogens here and will turn into water. So oxygen is the final electron acceptor. That means it's finally accepting the last hydrogens. And it's found in the end of the electron transport chain, as I have mentioned, the oxygen in the end of ATC. Oxygen can also accept protons or hydrogen ions, which we already mentioned there, and water is produced. So the whole process in this was just oxygen waiting for the hydrogens to come, and then once they combine, they form into water, and this all happens at the end of ETC. It helps maintain a proton gradient, that means across the inner membrane by the move of protons from the stroma. So basically this is a more detail, and this goes more for the HL students. So every time you have hydrogens coming to the stroma, to the stroma of the process of mitochondria, which actually this is supposed to be matrix. This is a mistake. in the exam. So when it comes from the matrix is that these oxygens will bind with the hydrogen and forming the water. So this reduces the amount of hydrogen inside and allowing the hydrogens that are inside here to come through. Oxygen is highly electronegative, is strongly attracted so electrons are strongly attracted to oxygen. In this case, we're talking about who? The hydrogens. The hydrogens have its electrons, and these electrons will basically inside of the hydrogen will be attracted to the oxygen. So the oxygen is pulling the hydrogen towards them, in this way forming the water. Eventually, you're trying to avoid anaerobic respiration because you want to try to avoid building lactic acid. Like I told you in the beginning, if you don't have oxygen, then you're going to start building lactic acid, and lactic acid can cause the pH to drop, and this way you're going to get tired. Now, allows more electrons to be delivered to the electron transport chain, and of course, this is where we talk about the Na and the FAD. These ones are being used, so these guys can go back to the Krebs cycle and get more hydrogens from it. So the oxygen, what it does is a maximum evaporative energy. So that means you're allowing to have about 38 ATP produced with that max. Now, that allows the oxidation of glucose. This means that we are getting out of the glucose hydrogens and carbons and oxygens. We're getting all these elements out of the glucose. Now, this is more like an HL answer, but it's important that you know this part here, that the oxygen is the final acceptor that is found at the end of the electron transport chain, and it's accepting the hydrogen and forming into water. This is more into the SL2, while these ones are more like the HL's answer. So, moving on to the next question. The next question says, the enzyme ATP is an essential role in the aerobic cell respiration. Here's just described location. Usually this is a 1 point. The question is, where is it found? So it's found in the inner mitochondria. So this is here the inner mitochondria, and it's folded like the cristae. So usually you will find the ETC right here, and in ETC you have basically the ATP synthase located in this. So this location is the cristae, which is basically found in the inner membrane. But you also can find in the thylakoid membrane when it comes to photosynthesis. Moving on. Next, it talks about explain the similarities, which are the same things, and the difference between the anaerobic and the aerobic cell respiration. So in this case, we already have the two sections. We know that anaerobic has no oxygen, while aerobic has oxygen. Now we know that anaerobic, you barely have any energy, so few energy produced, and if you want to be more detailed, you can say that it's only 2 ATP, while here you have a large yield of energy produced, and in this case we're talking about 36 to 38 ATP. The anaerobic usually happens in the cytoplasm, and that means only glycolysis happens, and after glycolysis there's fermentation. However, anaerobic, because there is oxygen, it also happens in the mitochondria, and that means we have glycolysis that happens in the cytoplasm, as well as we have the Krebs cycle and the ETC, all of these happening in the mitochondria. And eventually, with the oxygen, you are producing a lot of ATP. So these are basically some of the difference that you can see from them. Let's look at the mark scheme. So the most important thing is aerobic has oxygen and aerobic does not. That's the first difference that you have to put them to get the full marks. Now for similarities, they both start with glucose. That is true because they both start with glycolysis, which is the breaking down of glucose, which it says here. And they eventually, in the end of glycolysis, they both produce 2 ATP. So that means they're still producing energy. And they both produce pyruvate because the end of glycolysis, they both have pyruvate here being produced. Now CO2 carbon dioxide is also produced in both cases because as you go through the entire process, you are releasing CO2. As you inspire oxygen, you expire CO2. Now, The aerobic leads to Krebs cycle, anaerobic leads to fermentation. This will start to be more of a difference. But here they all do it after they go through glycolysis. So that will be the similarities. I would focus more on the idea of glycolysis. So where glucose comes into glycolysis and produces ATP, and as product it gets pyruvate. And of course release CO2 both at the end. Now when it comes to the differences, here's more of the differences that we have. So as an anaerobic, it basically is producing lactic acid, but if it's in yeast, it will produce ethanol and CO2, and it occurs in cytoplasm, as we said, and recycles NADH. When it comes to aerobic, which has oxygen, the pyruvate will go to mitochondria, as said, and of course, it will get rid of the CO2 and water through the Krebs cycle. You're going to produce a large amount of ATP, like you said, 36-AT. And of course, you can use other compounds like lipid and amino acid to produce energy if you're going through the aerobic respiration. So, usually their differences is very much, it has to do with the amount of ATP. Well, this is about 2 ATP, this is about 38 ATP. And this is usually happening mostly in the cytoplasm. And this one is mostly happening in the mitochondria. So you can see that. Here, you usually are producing lactic acid if you're in humans, ethanol and CO2 in yeast, while here is basically water and CO2. So these are the major differences between aerobic and anaerobic cell respiration. And this is pretty much the main questions that comes for ESA when it comes to cell respiration. But of course, they will ask you to state the equation, what happens with exercise, going from glucose to lactic acid, talk about how ATP is being released, and what kind of exercises you burn more carbs and lipids. So these can be found, the answers to this, in my video on cell respiration. But the questions that I went through right now are the most common questions for S cell when it comes to cell respiration. And that's pretty much it. Thank you.